E tunga mate haere atu rai. Tēnei wā o te kahui o te matariki, te whakatata mai o puanga ka hoki mahara hau ki tōku whānau i aua mea kua oki ai ana, rātau ai nei. Nō reira, mai i te tihi o mō te tau maunga ka riri atu i taku mihi, ki te tihi o Taranaki maunga, rā ke a koe e taku hoa o Taranaki, mai i reira ka whakawhiti, ki te maunga o Hikurangi, e hara i te maunga neki, ko te maunga tūtonu e. Mai i reira, ka huri taku mihi ki te maunga o ia au koutou, ko taku honore ki te tui ko nei, ki te tūwhera i te paipera tapu. Kia ora everybody. Man, it's a privilege to be here. It is a privilege to be here. Man, we were so blessed when we came along to the camp just a few months ago. It was so nice. It was one of those times where we're just chatting with so many people all the time. I don't feel like we hardly spoke to anybody, but just little snippets with everybody. But it was really nice just to be a part of it and to be worshipping and involved in that. So thank you for having us. Sorry, I do sound a little bit like Barry White this morning. I got a bit of a crook voice. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to open the Book of Amos, which I know is a very random choice of book to open, but it's just because it's the book that I've been studying, so that's why we're going to do that. Let's check if this is working. Oh, can we have those lights cut a little bit so we can see that? So, before getting into the Book of Amos, I thought it'd be cool to share a story from Te Tai Tokiro, from Northland, because it's always a good thing to do, I feel. So, for many iwi, you will have the starting name will be, say, Ngāti Parau or Ngāti Kahungunu, and the Ngāti in the front often refers to the people of Kahungunu, or the people who came with descendants of Kahungunu. Ngāti Hine, the descendants of Hine Amaru. Ngāti Parau, descendants of Paraurangi. Whereas Ngā Puhi, it doesn't quite work like that. We're not the descendants of Puhi, but we all descend from a person called Rahiri. And this is a carving of Rahiri, and there's a whakatauki from the north that says that if you descend from Rahiri, oh no, how does it go? It goes, if you're Ngā Puhi, but you don't descend from Rahiri, then you must be a cow. And for some reason, that's the whakatauki that's used in the north. Now, Rahiri, he arrived in Aotearoa on, well, there's a few different versions of the story, but either on the waka of Ngā Toki Matawhaurua or on the waka of Mātātua. It's kind of debated, and people will argue that one either way. But either way, Rahiri is what we call the eponymous ancestor of Ngā Puhi, who we all whakapapa through. Now, Rahiri, when he arrived in Aotearoa, he was searching for a wife. And the story goes that he lived in a place called Whiria, up in the north, and he went scouting around for a wife. And apparently the way he found his wife, a lady called Ahuaiti, was apparently she smelled very nice, and he could smell her from a very long way away, apparently. So I don't know if that is a technique we can still use today, but apparently she smelled very nice. And so he found this lady called Ahuaiti, and they had a son, and the son's name was Uenuku. Now, after some time passed, Uenuku grew a little bit, and then Rahiri, he had a dispute with his wife, and they ended up splitting ways. So Ahuaiti took her son, Uenuku, and they moved a little bit further down the island. In the meantime, Rahiri, he didn't waste any time in finding himself a new wife, and her name was Whakaruru. And so he found this lady. I don't know if he smelled this lady or not, but he found this lady somehow. They ended up having a son as well, and this son's name was Kaharo. Now, they kind of lived around Whiria, and kind of things were going well. Now, the other son, who kind of been ditched by the dad, Uenuku, he began to ask his mum and say, "Who's my dad?" He didn't really know where he came from, so he began to ask these questions. Where do I come from? And his mum eventually gave in and said, "Well, actually, you are the son of the famous Rahiri." And so at that moment, Uenuku goes, "Well, I'm going to go and confront him then." So he goes back and confronts his dad, Rahiri, and they have a bit of a standoff, especially when the other son is there as well, who thought that he was about to inherit everything, and then suddenly there's a mātāmua, an older sibling, involved there as well. So this comes to this dispute. Now, what Rahiri does is he says to his sons, this is the mountain called Whiria, and he's a clever man, Rahiri, and he says, what I want you to do is I want you to weave a rope out of harakeke, out of flax, all the way around the mountain. Now, I don't know if this is a true story or not, but this is just the story that we tell in the north. And so the sons started working together and they started weaving it. So that's where this mountain actually got its name, the word whiri, meaning to plait or weave together. So they are weaving all the way around it, and I imagine the story going something, maybe as they start with, they're still probably griping at each other and having a go at each other, but as they begin to get round and they're realizing that they had to work together, they began to realize and have an understanding for each other. Sorry, I'm moving in, I'm not standing still. But they began to have an understanding. And eventually they finished this rope made out of harakeke, and they attached it to a manuote. Now this is a manuote, which is like an old style kite. And they flew this manuote from Whiria, and it landed in a place called Kaikohe. I don't know if you've heard of Kaikohe. But what they did then is they said on one side of where this rope, kind of this big long rope went, they said on one side, that side is going to belong to Kaharo, one of the brothers, and the other side, from that land over the other side, is going to belong to Uenuku. And then a whakatauki came from that, which is ka mimiti te puna I taumārere, ka to tō te puna I hokianga, ka to tō te puna I taumārere, ka mimiti te puna I hokianga, which means when the puna or the source of water on taumārere is full, it's going to be empty in hokianga. But when it's full in hokianga, it's going to be empty in taumārere. And what this basically means, it's not talking about actual water, but it's talking about people being able there to help on either side. So if the hokianga was ever under attack, then taumārere would go to help them out. And if vice versa as well. Now, the reason I tell this story is because this is just because it's a great story from Taitokire, but also because it's an example of covenant in Aotearoa. Now, when we look at the book of Amos, we have to realize that everything leading up to that moment has always been about covenant. We've had 3 covenants, major covenants before that time. We've had the Abrahamic covenant, we've had the Mosaic covenant, and we've had the Davidic covenant. Now, these covenants were very unique in the fact that covenants weren't a unique thing in the Old Testament. But the reason they were unique here is because usually a god or a deity was involved in covenants between people, but they were seen as the overseer of that covenant, of that agreement. Whereas when we look at it here, God was actually one of the ones who was involved in that covenant and making that covenant with his people. Now, this is what makes it very unique. So when it comes, as we know, we're reading through the Old Testament, we see time after time after time, Israel and Judah, they continually break that covenant. And we kind of sit here in the 21st century all up ourselves saying, oh, how stupid were they? When really we weren't the ones who kind of went through that as well. But we eventually come into the book of Amos. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share some things. Hopefully some stuff will land well. Hopefully it'll just make you, my real goal this morning is just to make you think, oh, that's really interesting, and really want to kind of look a little bit more into the Old Testament and what that can say and speak to us about today. That's kind of my goal. So that's where we're going to go. Here's a lovely picture that I stole off the internet. Cool, so this is the area that we're talking about. I think I've got a laser here. So we have the northern kingdom of Israel, and then we have the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, the time period we're looking at is, I don't know about you, but I always used to get lost in the Old Testament on the time periods of the kings and the judges and where they all kind of sit together. So where we're at now is we've had the period of David's rule. Now, that was seen as a very high period in the rule of Israel and Judah, being able to unite the kingdoms. It was kind of seen as the pinnacle and often looked back to as a really kind of good time in the kingdom, in the history of Israel and the whakapapa of Israel. Now, again, what we're going to talk about is a little bit later on than that. So we know after David, things kind of fell apart a little bit until a man came in and his name was Omri. Now, we don't really know a whole lot about Omri when we read the Bible because he's not mentioned in it very much. But he was in charge of the northern kingdom of Israel. And it was actually one of the most prosperous times in Israel's history. Now, this picture obviously wasn't from back then. I think it was from the 1500s by a French artist. He doesn't make Omri look very flattering. But Omri was very successful, a very powerful leader, and led Israel to a very prosperous time. We do, however, know a little bit more about his son. He had a son whose name was Ahab. Now, what Omri did is the way he united the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah is that his son Ahab was put into a marriage with the lady Jezebel, who we know was from Phoenicia, and it didn't probably go down too well in the history of what we know about it. But that was his way of uniting the kingdoms. In fact, the house of Omri was actually the most well-known name for Israel by the Assyrians because it was such a successful house. So even after Omri fell and his whole dynasty went away, the Assyrians still referred to Israel as the house of Omri. Now, I think in the Old Testament, I think there's only probably one or two sentences that talk about Omri, so we don't really know too much of it from that. But there's lots in Assyrian writing that tells us about Omri and his house. So we have Ahab and Jezebel, and we know from the reading in 1 Kings about Elijah, he comes in and upsets them a little bit. He comes in with this prophecy which says, Ahab said to Elijah, "So you have found me, my enemy." "I have found you," he answered. I like that, it's kind of funny. "You have found me, my enemy." "Oh, I found you, all right," he answered. "Because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord." He says, "I'm going to bring disaster on you. I will wipe out your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make your house like that of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and that of Baasha, son of Ahijah." I just made those pronunciations up, but it sounded pretty good, I think. "Because you have aroused my anger and have caused Israel to sin." And also concerning Jezebel, the Lord says, "Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Dogs will eat those that belong unto Ahab who die in the city, and the birds will feed on those who die in the country." So it's not a very popular prophecy that Elijah brings to what is possibly one of the most popular and most successful houses or successful reigns in Israel. However, his prophecy does become true. And Ahab is killed, Jezebel is killed as well. And then Israel begins to go, and Judah begin to go through a time of a lot of tumult. So under Omri and under Ahab, they'd linked the two kingdoms. The kingdoms split again. We have the Aramaeans are coming and the Assyrians are on the scene. And there's a lot of kind of up and down throughout this time in history as well. And here we have, this is actually a stone picture of a man called Jehu. Now Jehu, he submits to Assyria, and again Assyrians come in. The Assyrians then get kicked out again by the Aramaeans, and then we go back into our. Okay. Oh yeah, this is interesting. So Israel's kind of under the Aramaeans at this time. The Aramaeans are constantly fighting against Israel, going backwards and forwards, and then we get to this verse, then Jehoah something sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw how severely the king of Aram, the Aramaeans, was oppressing Israel. The Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they escaped from the power of Aram. So the Israelites lived in their own homes as they had done before. Now, in the Bible, it doesn't actually say who this deliverer was, but again, from when we look through Assyrian kind of writings, it was the Assyrians who came into Damascus, which was where the Aramaeans were at that time, and kicked them out again. Now this is interesting because even though the Assyrians came in and kind of delivered Israel in this way, it says, but they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, which he caused Israel to commit. They continued in them. Also the Asherah pole remained standing in Samaria. So even though Yahweh is delivering his people, there is still this kind of clinging to the old way of doing things and to these old gods that is still going on. However, what we've got is, well, the Assyrians came in and they took Damascus, and everything kind of goes quiet there for a little bit. And the Assyrians and the Aramaeans are still kind of having their hustle and tussle. There's a few kind of other wars going on. But in that time, Israel is kind of a little bit peaceful for Israel and for Judah. And they begin to work together. And Israel and Judah become very prosperous. Again, they begin to link a little bit more. And they come again to a very high time of prosperity. We have King Jehoram of Israel and the king Uzziah of Judah begin to work. And they begin to kind of go into these different areas around. They get very prosperous. Israel is a very prosperous nation at this point, a lot more so than Judah. Judah's a lot smaller. And again, there would have been covenants made between Israel and Judah. Possibly more of the covenant where Judah was probably kind of a little bit under the wing, so they might have to pay a little bit more to Israel and that kind of thing. But in the end, it was a very successful time. And very rarely a very peaceful time of that time of history. And this is where Amos turns up, into this time. So Judah is doing very well for itself. Israel is doing very well for itself. And, you'd almost think, wow, God, you've kind of saved your people and you've made them really prosperous again, and things are going really well. And that you kind of would think that they would turn to Yahweh and say, this is great. Yahweh has delivered us again. We're kind of living in that promise. But Amos comes along with a very different message. So this is the first verse of Amos. The words of Amos, one of the shepherds of Tekoa. So who was Amos? He wasn't a prophet. He was a shepherd. Now, a lot of the other prophets would have been raised in schools of prophetic teaching, whereas Amos was not one of those people. Amos was a shepherd. And so people often use this as a very encouraging thing, knowing that for us today, we can all be called into prophecy, and we can all still prophesy. So that's a very encouraging thing about Amos, a very rare thing compared to him when you compare to him Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all of those other prophets. The vision he saw concerning Israel 2 years before the earthquake, you have Uzziah was king and Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, was king. So that means we're very easily able to date when the book of Amos was. So that's why they think probably about 760 BC. Now, the book of Amos is actually split into 3 different sections. Now, often when approaching the prophets or some of the books of the prophets, I find them really hard to approach when you don't know a little bit about them because they just seem really gloomy all the time. And I'm one of those people who, when there's constant, hating on nations, I just begin to skip or begin to fall asleep a little bit when reading it. So I find it very helpful just to go back and find out a little bit about it. And hopefully that's what this is going to inspire you to be able to do a little bit more. So in chapters 1 and 2, what we have is something called the oracles against the nations, which again doesn't sound very, very great. But basically, what we have here, that's Tekoa there in the kingdom of Judah. That's where Amos was from. And he goes up north into Israel, mainly around this area of Bethel. And this is where he begins to share his words, and a lot of his kind of prophecies against Israel come in. So I guess one question would be to think about, if you were from Israel, what would you think to have someone come up from the smaller, less important place and begin to prophesy against you? I imagine they probably didn't take it in the greatest way. Yeah. So these oracles are very interesting. The first oracle that gets made is against Damascus. Now remember, Damascus, as we've talked about before, is where there's a lot of fighting. So this part of Syria, Damascus at the top, between the Arameans coming into Israel a lot of the time. So the first prophecy, or oracle against the nations that he gives is, what he does is he starts all of these by saying, for 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4 I will not relent. And that's kind of his little kind of way of sharing each of his oracles. For the 3 sins or more, I will not relent. And then he goes in and says what they've done wrong, because they've threshed Gilead with sledges having iron teeth. Now, these kind of sledges, threshing sledges, what they were used for is they were kind of big boards like this, and they had lots of sharp teeth on the bottom of them. And what people would do is they'd get all their wheat, put all their wheat down on the floor, and then drag these kind of threshing sledges over the top to get all the grain off of the wheat. Now, it was often used as a metaphor for when a nation had been kind of gone into and attacked, but they were already really weak anyway, so it wasn't really like a great heroic victory. You'd basically just gone in and abused a whole load of people. So with this part of it, it could be that this is what Amos is saying, that you guys were too heavy on people that you've already gone for, or there was a very literal torture method where they do this kind of similar thing to people. And so the book of Amos is very graphic. And so we're not too sure which one Amos is kind of saying at this point, but this is why he's talking against Damascus for that part there. And then all of these kind of oracles against the nations, they finish with him going, because you've done this, I'm going to send fire. God's going to send fire on your area. So they're very positive. We then go on to Gaza. And it's very important, I think, we'll go into why, but it's very important to see the map. So for the 3 sins of Gaza, or for 4 I will not relent, because she took captive whole communities and sold them to Edom. Nice and simple, that one. And because they've done this, what was God going to do? He's going to send fire on Edom. Again, for Tyre, we see it now at the top left there. So for 3 sins of Tyre, even for 4 I will not relent, because she's again sold whole communities to Edom. So we can kind of see what's going on in that area at that time. That Edom was probably a place of mass kind of human trafficking, as well as people were constantly sending. Yeah. And then we get to Edom, because he slaughtered the women of the land. Again, 3 sins, or for 4, I will not relent. But because he has slaughtered the women of the land, I will send fire on Edom. So we begin to see this kind of way that Amos prophesies, kind of going through these same motions. Then goes to Ammon over here. Now, this one, again, is a very gruesome one. For 3 sins or 4 of Ammon, I will not repent, because he ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead. Now, this, again, could be a metaphor for genocide, but it was also a known practice of the Assyrians to do that, to wipe out people groups. It was seen as a torture that they'd come and do in one place, and it would kind of scare everyone else to leave. And the Assyrians, very, very brutal people, some of their leaders. But actually, there was also one king of Israel who does this as well, and is called out for it as well. So it was not an uncommon practice, but again, a horrific practice. And because of that, what's God going to do? He's going to send fire on Ammon. Next, we go to Moab. For 3 sins, or for 4 of Moab, I will not repent, because he burned to ashes the bones of Edom's king. Again, so this is a kind of a practice of violating tikanga that is happening here. So when you're going in and into these wahi tapu, or sacred spaces, a way that they'd kind of, certain places would put their kind of authority is by grounding up the bones of the people who had died there, and then they could use it similar to kind of limestone to decorate the sides of buildings. So it was actually kind of decorating your cities with ground up. Yeah. Yeah. It's not, anyway, yeah, it's not. It's a very gruesome book, but we'll get there. Don't worry, we'll get there. So because they've done this, what will God do? God will send fire. So I don't know if you've noticed, but we've kind of been going in a kind of a pattern, going around like this in a way, going there, all over the place. Now, when you're reading it and you don't have a map in front of you, it can seem real random, like why are these random places being called out in these orders? And the reason people think that it's being done as almost like a kind of a spiral that's kind of going in and in and in and in like this, spiraling further and further and further in. Now, if you're the people of Judah or Israel, knowing that you're now in a great time of prosperity and you're feeling very good, Yahweh's looking after you, then you might be going, oh yeah, too right, those other places should be, this is good, Yahweh's for us. But then we get to Judah. Now, why is Judah being rejected by God? Because they have rejected the law of God. And what's the punishment for Judah? God will send fire on Judah. Now, I find this very interesting, because you have all these other kind of places that are being punished for horrendous crimes. But I find it interesting that God holds those crimes to the same kind of standard as if they rejected his law and his covenant. They're his covenant people. And because they're his chosen covenant people, they should do better. They should know better. I find that quite interesting. And then, of course, prophesying into Israel, they're probably feeling very smug. Either they're feeling very smug right now, or they're going, oh no, we're the last one left. And as soon as you might hear him going, for 3 sins, even for 4, they go, oh no, it's coming. And so he goes for Israel. And I'm going to read it out. It's quite long, but it's important to hear. For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and deny justice to the oppressed. Father and son use the same girl, and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. In the house of their God they drink wine taken as fines. So Israel, again, this is probably a bit more than what we saw with Judah, but they sell the innocent for silver. This is the first one that they get pulled up for. Now, in the Old Testament, when Israel got saved out of Egypt, we see a God who is very anti-slavery from that point on, because he saw his people being sold into slavery in Egypt. And yet, for some reason, Israel, who, as a people of whakapapa, should have known better, continued to sell people into slavery in those times. And this is something that God is very upset about. So anyway, it's a depressing start to the book of Amos. I have a few questions. So what I'd like you to do is turn to your mate, the one next to you. There's a few people sitting by yourselves, but someone will grab those people who's sitting by themselves and answer your question. Just have a little chat in your peers. My voice is beginning to go a little bit, so this is working quite well. Just have a little chat. And what do you think? What do you think of these verses? And the other question was, Yahweh never actually made a covenant with those other places around. So do you find it interesting that Yahweh is still holding these other people as if they had some form of covenant? What do you think about that? Those are some questions. Have a little wānanga with your mate, and then we'll come back.